How's it going, y'all? My name is Aiden Anderson, and this is Candidate Candids. In this series, I'm going out to meet and talk with the candidates in the upcoming Moscow City Council election to better know them and to better understand their platform and how they hope to serve our community. In this interview, I meet with Moscow City Council candidate Drew Davis. Let's get into it. Drew, how you doing?
Doing good. I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. Been asking all the candidates this, but 2.5 weeks basically until the election. How have things been going for you?
I think good. Each week you always learn something more. You talk to one more person, you learn about the next issue, and so it's just good being out there, being a little bit more visible, and having conversation. So, which I think that's what public office should do.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, you were appointed.
Correct.
Back in the day, and I'd like to get into that, but just to start, how has it been? You're running as an incumbent, but it's also your first year campaigning. Has there been anything that's been unexpected, something where you didn't realize you were going to have to put this on your schedule, or I didn't realize that I was going to have to care about this issue or this group of people? What are the surprises there?
Yeah, and so I wouldn't say there has been any surprises, more or less. It's just I kind of compare it to it's a sprint, right? Well, like once campaign starts, it's just a steady sprint to the end. And so I'm just pacing myself for the sprint and getting ready to kick it into high gear. So.
Yeah. And when you say kick it into high gear, is there stuff yet to come? Is it about to get even more busy, or is it sort of smooth sailing until election day at this point?
Yeah, so my approach to the campaign in general is like, slow jog, and then just keep on the intensity all the way through. And so intensity means just reaching out more people, connecting with more people throughout the campaign. And so, in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be talking to a lot more people, more house parties, and just try to get to know citizens of Moscow a little bit more, which comes mostly through, I'll probably be knocking on someone's door. So.
Yeah, I know the door knocking experience is one that a lot of politicians around here go through, and there's always some interesting stories that come out of that.
Yes.
So I don't know if that's something to be looking forward to or something to be on edge about, but I imagine it won't be a dull moment.
Yeah, no, it won't be dull. I have a background in door-to-door sales, and so something I'm kind of used to, even though I'm not selling anything, but the initial nature of just being on someone's doorstep can be nerve-wracking, and so I actually like it, and so it's kind of fun engaging in that kind of manner.
Yeah.
Or one-to-one.
You'll have to remind me, what month was it this past year that you were appointed to council?
Yeah, so it was actually last year in 2022, in December. So about middle of December is when I was appointed to council by Mayor Becky.
Gotcha. And I don't know a whole ton about the appointment process. What was that like as an experience on your end?
Yeah, so previously for that, I'll lead up into it. I was serving as a commissioner on planning and zoning. And so I was in my second year of that. So working on planning and zoning was great. Got to know Mayor Becky through that. But out of the blue in December, and no joke, I was shopping for Christmas for one of my kids. And I get a call, and it's Mayor Becky, and he's like, "Hey, you've been recommended for city council. And I know your credentials, I know what you've been involved with planning and zoning. We think that perspective is needed. He liked my educational background in architecture. I'm practicing for an architecture firm, and I also teach architecture. And so with that paired with planning and zoning and working across kind of the northwestern United States in different cities, I think that's why I felt it was appropriate to appoint me to it.
Mm-hmm. I think I remember watching the meeting that you were appointed at remotely and being a little bit entertained by the proceedings that actual day, because there were some, I don't want to say points of contention, but there was definitely a little bit of confusion about the process, I think, just because appointments are so rare.
Yeah, I think, appointments, especially for city council, although they're not unheard of, they're just not typical. Mm-hmm. And especially to Moscow, there's been appointments before. There's been, a handful, I'd say, in the last 15 years or so. Mm-hmm. And so for me, Mayor Becky kind of told me to have an opening statement, introduce myself to council, and it would be something that would be a discussion, but in my mind it was kind of not a done deal, but it was pretty certain that it was. And I didn't really know what to expect, to be quite honest with you. And so came in, gave my introduction, and then it called for kind of a sustaining vote, if you will, right? And yeah, there was a pretty good discussion that wasn't necessarily directed at me, and my fellow now colleagues were pretty clear about that. But the appointment process, how I understood it, is they wanted to appoint different people. For most of them, I was an unknown entity, right? They might have heard of me on planning and zoning, but not a lot of interaction besides that with them. And so I think they probably had someone that they recommended that they might have wanted. Mayor Becky I think heard kind of different views and made a decision, and his, he's able to make those decisions as mayor to who he chooses to appoint when that happens. And so he exercised that ability. And luckily, all council members, ratified that and accepted me, voted, didn't have any, no one vote against that. And I'm proud to say it's been about 10, 11 months. We're coming up on the 11th month I've been there. I've enjoyed working with everyone on council. I appreciate their input. And I think, the 6 of us I think they've accepted me for my credentials, and have all 5 of their supports, including the mayor, right? So technically 6 if you're including the mayor. And then past that, they see my value, kind of the knowledge bank that I'm bringing to council. So
Yeah. No, that's really good to hear. Having been on council for as long as you have now, I imagine there's some areas of expertise or areas of interest that you've developed since joining council that wasn't there previously because you were just focused on planning and zoning issues. Is there any particular area that you've discovered through working with the city that's you know what, I didn't know anything about this before coming into this position, and now that I'm in this position, I'm interacting with this a lot more regularly, and it's something that I've actually developed an interest in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I would say there was nothing that I learned where I was surprised about, where it's I didn't know that's how the city operated, right? I did learn that there's a lot more meetings to attend, which I was expecting, but which is great, and I'm happy to do those things. But the one thing that I am I'm wanting to carry, and I've had conversations, but really nothing's been moved in such a manner, is I really think we need to look at our parking in the terms of not downtown parking or anything like that, but when new developments are occurring, multifamily or apartment, whatever you want to say, there's a really high demand on the parking count. And so having those conversations, I think, could help with some of the issues that we're facing with housing in Moscow.
Yeah. I know parking ends up being a hot button topic just out of the convenience of accessing something like the downtown, but that's a separate discussion from some of the housing stuff that you're bringing up. They're interconnected insofar as I guess a town is connected to itself between its neighborhoods and its downtown district and all that. But when it comes to the actual boots on the ground, what we do, I imagine you do have to kind of treat them as separate issues.
Oh yeah, 100%. And my kind of stance, I'm pretty open about the parking downtown. Last weekend was homecoming, probably the busiest weekend Moscow's seen in, I would say, maybe a decade. I could be wrong. I don't have any hard numbers to support that.
I mean, it was sold out at Vandal Stadium, so.
And plus WSU had homecoming. A lot of people came over here. And so I would say I wouldn't be surprised. Again, I don't have the numbers, but just by witnessing the crowd, I've been here for the last 11 years, biggest crowd I've ever seen in Moscow, right? And still people only had to park a couple blocks away to get here, right? Or they rode their bikes down here.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you think about it in those terms, being a couple blocks away from an event, that's not a parking crisis for downtown. My issue with parking, as you brought up, it's kind of separate, has directly to do with housing that we're building around town. I'd like to find other ways, looking at other models about how we could reduce that so we could get more units on the land. One, it helps put more, the more units we have, the easier it is for people to live, right? Secondly, it makes the property a little bit more, it performs financially a little bit better, solves 2 problems.
Yeah, I mean, I'm completely uninformed on this topic, so I imagine, as I imagine a lot of people are when it comes to the interworkings of something like development. But the initial question that comes to mind when I hear about challenges like that and getting more units on a given piece of land is, why not just build up? Is that an option? Are there difficulties to it that, the average person might not be considering? what would your thoughts be on that?
So that's a good question, and I definitely agree with going vertical in a lot of options, right? The area, again, when we come back to, is there are pieces of land where you can, but again, it's like, if you go up, then where do the cars go, right?
Right.
And so oftentimes, if we're talking about density, we live in northern Idaho and a small town, and so most people have cars. I don't think cars are going away. I'd like it to become more walkable. I'd like to encourage those things, but the city doesn't govern what people can do privately with, buying cars or driving. And I'm not interested really in like making, because the legislature won't let us do that, right? And so, but when we go vertical, cars still have to go somewhere. Parking garages are really a steep commitment financially, and I don't know if they're the best option. And so, but I do agree going higher. Typically, you'll see that most apartment complexes that are being built are about 3 stories, and that's due to the building code. They're typically wood construction. Anytime that you get higher than 3, and then also you have to introduce an elevator, and so a lot of complexities come with that make the project more expensive. Which also doesn't cater to the fact that if we're trying to make housing more affordable, adding more expenses to that are another thing. And so I think if we look at parking and can condense things and do a little bit more infill development, there's a really interesting book that I recommend, and I've been telling a lot of people about. It's called The Missing Middle, and it talks about the missing housing that we have in our country that we need, and that has to do with infill development. So.
Yeah, I know some of the concerns about development have been expressed in terms of affordable housing questions, and you're currently working with the Affordable Housing Commission as a liaison. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, fair and affordable housing.
Fair and affordable housing.
Yes.
To what extent, I guess, can the city directly address some of those fair and affordable? Obviously, you have a commission that's working on those issues. That's very different than saying, well, the city has it in their code to be able to allow for certain things. What's the extent of authority there as you see it?
So the short answer is not a lot. And that's not to say that's not important. I'm not trying to sound like it doesn't matter, because it absolutely does matter. But, these are private land matters, right? And the city typically doesn't get involved in private land matters, only in regards to like zoning, right? And how the planning of the land is, which we have, a city, plotted and different uses for the city, and then how the zoning is being used on the land. That's really the peripheral of like the city and what's in their, like, I guess, in their jurisdiction. And so talking about these other issues to me is, it's really hard. So there's a lot of good intent on affordable housing. And the way I explain to people is, I think that commission is like necessary and important, but we need to have a pulse on it. So people have a pulse on what's happening and can see, but for like legal recourse or buying land, that's just something that cities typically don't do, especially the size of our town, and don't do just because of, 1, financial restrictions, 2, like we don't want to get involved in like legal matters for the most part, and so authorizing those things. And the third one is the legislature, right, has a lot of restrictions of what cities can do to like have affordable housing. So there's ways to navigate it, but we're often as cities, we're pretty limited to response. And so I think there needs to be, 1, I'm always interested in talking to legislatures about how, and we call it affordable housing, workforce housing. There's a lot of different terms that get thrown around. It's, and I have some ideas how I think we can solve it or start conversations that I want to talk to you about, but that's, it's good to know about the issues that are happening so we know where our city's at. And I think from a fair perspective, making sure that all people are represented from a fair, everyone's getting that. I think we do a pretty good job. There's always an exception, right? But I don't know anywhere in the country, or to be honest, anywhere in the world that has affordable housing right now.
Right. I think I had heard it phrased from a friend of mine that basically Moscow is experiencing the same wave of housing difficulties that everybody else has been experiencing in other places. It's just hit at a different time because of where we are geographically, how our economy functions, what kind of state we are. And so at one level, we're not going through anything that no one else isn't going through.
Well, 100%, yeah. Like, yeah, this is not a unique problem to Moscow. And actually, if you look at other cities and people across the nation, I think like we're we're not doing good, but we're not the worst. And so I don't know if that's good or bad, but I think we need to still focus on the issue.
Are there examples then, when you look at other cities who, because they're dealing with similar issues or whatnot, are there examples, maybe in Idaho, maybe in the surrounding states, that you look at and say, you know what, I think that might be more feasible for Moscow, or we could try something similar in terms of actions that the city could undertake or conversations you could have with developers?
Yeah, and so I think the biggest, so I'll answer the question this way, is that I think when I talk to people about housing, right, I think there needs to be, it'd be great if everyone in Moscow for the most part was informed in a way where we all understood the issue. Because there's a lot of things that people read on different news sources, and that's great, right? But people derive their own opinions that necessarily aren't things that we can do in Idaho, let alone Moscow. And so I think part of, I think a caveat to solving this issue, I feel strongly, and something that I'm going to be working on is having, we have a water summit, which I think has been really helpful for Moscow, and we're seeing traction on that. I think we need to have a housing summit. And part of what the housing summit could do is help educate the general public about ways we can navigate housing in Idaho. I think you can look for case studies, how other states have applied, but I think that it can't just be policy that solves this problem. It has to be, has to come from the private sector too. And so part of why we're seeing housing become so expensive is I think we have a decreasing labor force. And so for a long time, I think which is fine, I have a higher education degree, a master's degree in architecture, but we've talked about people just need to go to school and get this, but we don't have really any people to build the houses, right? So we don't have a workforce, and so the workforce is out there is extremely overwhelmed, and then they have the ability to basically charge prices because there's not a lot of competition, right? And I don't see that changing in the next decade, to be quite honest with you. So I think we need to encourage, I think blue collar work is extremely important, and the sense of craftsmanship and built-ability is incredibly keen to what we do. And I think that's a nation thing. I'd like to see that. Moscow is not a cheap place to build anything. And so one, it's educating the public. Two, it's really encouraging people that blue collar work's great work. You have a great career in that, right? I work with a lot of craftsmen, and they do noble work, and they're very intelligent people. And so I think that's one issue of it. Kind of diving back to the housing summit, when we all start talking and understanding what those issues are, then I think that's where the synergy happens of where to pivot. Because if you have a whole bit different people thinking a whole bit of different ideas, like let's take the water issue, right? They have 4 or 5 alternatives, right? So they've broken it down. So I think we could do the same thing with housing, which gets people focused on problems, and that allows us to respond, I think, in a respectable way, that where we're just not spinning our wheels and ideas or dreams that can't happen for Moscow.
Right. And like you said, it's a multifaceted issue with a lot of different problems within problems, so to speak. So a labor force problem impacts the problem with pricing, impacts the rate at which you can develop houses in new areas. And at the same time, you can't just say one of those issues is the core problem that you have to try and solve. You have to develop a holistic approach. And like you were saying, you're dealing with a private sector holistic approach more so than a policy-centered approach to a lot of these things because of what the city is limited in terms of what it can do and that sort of thing.
Yeah, even like jurisdictions like Seattle, they're still kind of, and this is the part that I deal with that's also frustrating. Seattle has like a lot of affordable housing, but there's a lot of red tape that you have to go through that delays projects. And so they've stretched out the timeline in order to get these things, which then makes the overall cost of the housing more expensive. And so we need to, again, policy is super important to solve this, right? I think it needs to come on a national and state level. However, we can't have policy that extends these ways. We need like really efficient ways to build quicker and quality. It's one thing to build, like we just need to expedite some processes. And so if I had a really good solution, I'd probably be doing it, but it has to come it has to come through like this synergy of talking to lots of people.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, I think that I think I'm in agreement with you that something like a housing summit could be very beneficial, especially oriented locally towards the local developers, local builders, and the people who are also interested in the fair and affordable side of things, to be able to sit down, have that conversation, but actually also get a chance to educate the general public on the issues.
Yeah, and I also think another way to bring another party to bring to the table, or another partner, is like the financial side of it, right? Like the lenders and all these other people. Like that's oftentimes, like that's sometimes the biggest hurdle for these things, is like the financial model. In the architecture development world, we call it the capital stack. How that funding package is put together in order to literally go start buying and paying people to get it started.
Yeah.
And so, two other things I wanted to mention. I could talk for days about this, so I'll try to be short.
No worries.
Is I think there's a lot of interesting private ways that people are trying to solve affordable housing. And so, P3s, public-private partnerships, I think are really a good way that the city can work in. They don't, and I think just be an advocate for that. The university is going to enter into one here pretty shortly on campus, which I'm super glad that they're doing something like that. I think it's a good model. Another way is like smaller ways. I mean, literally people are crowdfunding housing. And that's a bit of a financial kind of like how you collect money. So you have to have a really good like accountant, CPA on board to get that paperwork squared away. But there's a lot of ways. And then another way too is there's a group, it's called Guerrilla Development out of Portland, and they're actually addressing the homeless issue, building new buildings. And so typically it's a different model where you don't get as high as return on your investment, but part of it is like your social investment and to solve the problem.
Right.
So you take, if you're expecting 9% back, you might be getting 4% back. With the 5%, it's like, hey, I've helped fix this issue. And so there's a lot of really cool models that I think people can explore if you want to be creative. And so, as I said, it just can't be policy. It just can't be the public side or the private side. All entities have to come together to start making creative solutions to solve this.
Yeah. And it's just finding the opportunity to facilitate those conversations to get the ball rolling, so to speak.
100%.
Yeah. Well, not to pivot all the way off of development, but I am curious about your time in the world of architecture.
Yeah.
I guess, tell me how you got into it. How does one settle on building cool buildings for a living?
Yeah. So, so growing up, I really loved to draw. And if you'd ask any of my classmates, I by no means was like an artist, right? I wasn't displaying things on the wall, but I really liked the practice of thinking about something and being able to put like a pencil and paper to it and just kind of sketching ideas. I'm no exception to most little kids. I love building forts or tree forts or anything. And so I really like the tactile nature of like assembling things and getting that together. I've always found I really like material, and any chance I had to build something or do that was awesome. And then of course through art, I always have loved art, even though I don't really think I'm an artist. I've just always appreciated doing it. And then the other part is started like junior high through high school. I had classes like woodshop, where I'd actually have to design and build something. I had a drafting class. And so for the longest time, I couldn't really decide if it was going to be engineering, architecture. If I was going to be an engineer, I really, got into like space. And so I thought for the longest time being like talking about designing stuff for space, robots, all those things, aeronautical stuff. And but after like going through math classes in college and drawing, I really figured out my passion was for like creating, not doing math problems all the time.
Right.
And so mostly and I always wanted to work for NASA, right? That was a goal, but I also really liked architecture. And so when I started I went to a community college before I came to Idaho, University of Idaho, and I just did drafting. And at the end of that, I was like, I really feel kind of drawn to the built environment. And so applied, got a master's degree, and I'm still 11 years later, still walking up the hill every other day teaching a class. And so just the passion of creating, and I feel lucky that what I do for a living is something that's also kind of a hobby. if you ask my family and, Kimi or any of the kids when we go on a trip, I'm always probably looking up a unique building and wanting to go and see it. And so they're pretty patient with it. Like with my how I call myself a building nerd. And so I'm sure when my kids get older, they won't be as patient, but I enjoy looking at different buildings and such. So
Yeah. When it comes to those buildings that you like looking at, I'm sure as an architect you have to be pretty widely read, but is there any particular style or set of buildings or architects from history that particularly resonate with you and your vision for the kinds of buildings you like being a part of?
And so the interesting about architecture, no matter how far you go back in history, like how we've built structures has changed dramatically, right? We used to engineer for if you take like any ancient ruin, they've been there for, sometimes thousands of years, right? And so we've engineered to the maximum capability and designed for that, right? And so throughout, I'd say like history, we've seen this change of how people have evolved building styles and design and architectural intent based on construction methodology, right? And so it's hard sometimes to say, even though I appreciate certain styles, how we build buildings, we necessarily couldn't do that, right? So I really, obviously there's only been one culture, it's been pyramids, because it's like labor intensive material, it took hundreds of years, right? And I'm not really saying I like the pyramids as like an architectural study, but,
right. As an example.
Yeah, as an example. But I really like like kind of Scandinavian architecture, if you will, or Japanese kind of craftsmanship with wood. And so if you look at they're really about materiality, connecting to nature. They're talking about the integrity of material, and then the connection of material. And somehow, something that's frustrating about modern day how we build things is it's completely the opposite now, where we've moved away where we want to engineer it to just barely stand up, right? We don't engineer to the maximum, we engineer to the minimum with minimum material, which, because I get it, things are expensive, right? But oftentimes we've lost this sense of craftsmanship. And so if I was to, most people don't, if there's a firm that I point to that I really, really like, it's called Bolin Lewinsky Jackson. They have offices all over the country and they do phenomenal work. They're also known as BCJ, and they kind of dive into different areas. And so really I think if you could, and then other architects, unfortunate thing is you say architect and there's no one's perfect, and so people often tack their personality, not their work. But I really like the city of Chicago. I spent a week there last summer, or 2 summers ago now, but just kind of that movement where skyscrapers were invented. I wouldn't want to live in one or live there full time, but I really like how the evolution of that happened, and kind of that area. So I'm really interested in but I also appreciate really historic things too, right? Even though I'm not designing historic structures, I do think it's important that we preserve and utilize those. And so if I was to design a house, it'd probably be a little bit more contemporary.
I was going to say, when I think of Swedish design, I think of those A-frame cabins you see in Airbnb type ads all the time. And I have a certain degree of appreciation for them, but I've never stayed in one, so I wouldn't know if I would actually consider it livable or not.
Yeah, I think probably for an Airbnb, you'd probably have a good time. I don't know, living would be good. It might be a good cabin or something. But yeah, I think just the notion of Nordic or Scandinavian design is always kind of focused on honest material, right? Not what's available, and then how is that directing you and connecting you to nature, right? And so I think those concepts really are the thing that I'm more attracted to, rather than the actual building and how well they do them. It's more of the philosophy of the approach to how the structure, what was the design intent and how it's connecting to its location. So placemaking, I think is super important to what they're saying, that's my favorite building, right? But there's we're lucky to have 2 universities pretty close by. There's some really good examples of architecture, and there's some really terrible examples of architecture on both campuses. So you get to decide what that is, right? The beauty of architecture is it's left up to the individual to decide and to find appreciation for it. So.
Well, at the risk of exposing your opinions then, because you teach your classes at the University of Idaho?
Correct, yeah, I teach at the University of Idaho.
What would your students say is your least and favorite buildings if you were to ask them?
Oh, what my least and favorite buildings are. So there's like a running joke that I always say, and I do it at most of my classes. And I always, just to get to know students a little bit, so I say, what's your favorite building? And then I say, before you answer, you can't say the Kibbe Dome. And so it's not that I don't like the Kibbe Dome, but it's technically not a dome. And so that's a weird part, right? And so and I jokingly say, if it's the Kibbe Dome, maybe you shouldn't be studying architecture. And so I'd say that's a joke, but and I actually appreciate the Kibbe Dome. One, from like the structural feat that it was, like the span was actually pretty impressive at its time. It's a pretty large wooden span, keep in mind. And so that's pretty incredible. But if there's a building that I don't like, buildings that don't have windows. So, yeah, I'll kind of keep it in that approach. You know, I'm very opinionated about buildings, and so if you're walking or traveling with me, I'll definitely give my critique of a building. But getting a building through building permits is actually really difficult, and it's kind of a miracle that buildings are built. And if you get a really good-looking one, I think you're kind of lucky. And so I'm just trying to make good-looking buildings. That's all I'm trying to do. and like they fit the users and the context and the place.
Switching gears a little bit, I know that your family has featured prominently in your campaign and in some of the stuff that you've talked about. How has it been balancing a family life with sort of the council activities alongside teaching, alongside running stuff in the architecture world?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So all I have to say, so my Kimi and I have been married for 13 years, and so for us, I just think she's amazing, right? She's had to pick up a lot of the slack since I've been busy campaigning, but collectively we've both decided this is something that was important to both of us. There's been a couple bedtime stories, homework, a couple soccer games I missed this fall in order to kind of keep the campaign, going and conversations. But I really feel like it's what I'm doing. So, for example, when I come into work and from 8 to 5, that's all I'm doing. I'm working 8 to 5, right? When I go out and campaign, all I'm doing is working on the campaign. When I go home, when I go to a soccer game, it's family. And I try not to although those worlds shift, but I personally don't believe in like work-life balance. I really believe that you have to focus on what you're doing and do the best at the time, live in the present. And then when that thing comes at the end of the day, you try to focus. Easier said than done. But, my kids are really patient. It's funny. They'll watch me on city council meetings and this is their words, not mine, keep in mind, but they think I'm a movie star because they see me on YouTube, right? Yeah, but if they only knew there's probably 12 people watching, it's really not a movie star, and really I'm not an actor. I have a lot of support from Kimi. And, Kimi's been doing a lot of the heavy lifting at home and helping also with the campaign too. All these signs that you see scattered across town, she's dropping them off on the day. She's, she campaigns in her areas where she has friends and colleagues and influence. And so, and then of course the kids were ecstatic in the parade. It was great. We decided that they were going to scooter. So we put our campaign signs on the scooter. And we attached a candy bucket, and then our 2-year-old, we didn't have him a scooter. We just pushed him in our little bike stroller, and then we just kind of walked together as a family, and we're kind of in this together. And I feel super fortunate that the kids and Kimi want to support my goals just as much as I want to support their goals. So
excellent. And it's good to see the synergy in something like the parade, of course.
Yeah.
Where you guys can be as a family, but also it serves all these other purposes in terms of being able to showcase what you're about as a city councilor, what you're about as, in your other hat, as a family man, that sort of thing.
Yeah. No, and I think honestly, all my colleagues that are currently on council, they're wonderful, and I have just the utmost respect for all their backgrounds and everything that they've done for the city, and because we always necessarily, me and the other counselors, we don't always agree, and that's the beauty of a council. And then all those that are running right now, I find myself in a unique situation. That's why I wanted to run again. Is I do have a young family, and I think the perspective of young families is needed on city council. It's one thing to say that you've raised a family, and that's super noble and commendable, and it's okay if you haven't, right? It's totally okay, that perspective. But I do think that someone that has a young family that takes kids to the park, takes kids to the pool, is in Parks and Rec. My wife's coaching Parks and Rec right now, pre-K soccer, and so those perspectives I think are incredibly important to our community, because adults can vote, kids can't, thank goodness. But their perspective, right? Their perspective is still critical, and I think they need a voice. And I think I can help with that voice. Lots of our friends have young families. Lots of my friends don't have families at all, right?
Yeah.
But those that do have families, I want to make sure, and even if you don't know me and you have a family, I want you to be able to reach out to me and know how there's a good chance I might not be able to do anything, but I think listening and finding the resources to do that are critical.
And it makes sense because, of course, the council, you want it to be representative of the city that they are the representatives for. And I think, as the city grows, I've seen quite a few young families come in dealing with some of the same housing issues that we were talking about earlier.
Oh, it's impossible to find a home if you're a young family.
Yeah. But it makes sense then that you would run on that principle, because it is a clear group of people that needs to be represented. And I imagine, maybe this is extrapolating too far, but I imagine looking at a young family that has yet to live many of their years in a given town, that shows an investment in the future rather than as an establishment or as an old guard, if you were. Yeah. It's a forward-thinking move to take your family someplace and start to develop things there.
Yeah. And, I kind of have two responses, and they're kind of in two different ways. So I'll kind of talk about those. So I've been serving as a liaison for council for Parks and Rec. And I really feel comfortable there because I've coached for Parks and Rec. Parks and Rec for me growing up was really important. I think it's a really important organization that, helps fight, helps encouraging kids how to exercise against obesity. It finds ways to help them manage their emotions. It finds ways of different ways of communicating. And, it should help healthy competition, right? Knowing how to compete in a healthy way, I think, is also important, right? And so what I've learned from that is that there's two things. When going to Parks and Rec and seeing parents and talking to parents, I really want them to know that they're heard, right? And because it's really frustrating. Sometimes being a parent, I think sometimes you just feel alone, right? And especially if you don't have, if you don't have a partner or anything, that also can become difficult. And so I like that ability that what Parks and Rec, what it can offer. The second one, I can't even remember right now what I was going to talk about. It might come back to me, but if it does, I'll shoot it in here. So.
Now, of course, with every campaign season, it seems like there's always a little bit of a theme, right? The issues that people are saying that they're focusing on, what a lot of the forums have been asking questions about. I think we touched on one big one earlier with the housing development conversation, and then that's also partnered with the water issues and some of the climate sustainability questions that are interconnected with those things. Yep. I'm curious, as you look at things from both an internal perspective as a current sitting councilor, as well as in your campaign as you're looking around, is there anything outside of that theme for this year that you think, the city ought to also focus on this, and if I was to get elected, this is something I would try to advocate for?
That's a good question, and I think it's a question that people have brought up, which I'm glad you're bringing up. What else is out there that we can, is there anything that we can focus on, right? That's also important. And so my immediate answer is there's probably a lot of things, right? To pick one or two is difficult. One thing that I've heard is just, I want to make sure that because a part of, I feel like my role on council and running is also educating people of what city council can do. Because there's a lot of frustrating things in our community that city council has no jurisdiction over, right? And so one thing is like being a liaison to the city and saying, yes, I understand this is frustrating. Yes, I understand that. You know, people are like, what are you going to do about we need some more public schools. As a city council member, I can't do anything about that. Truly, I want to, but it's not in our jurisdiction to handle that. That's more of a school board issue. And so, but for me, if I look around the city and I look about, I've talked a lot about infrastructure, but the one thing I'll say, and it goes back to Parks and Rec, is we see, and again, I'm not a medical, I'm not trained as a physician or anything.
Right.
So everyone take that for what it's worth. But I do feel like we're seeing increases of depression, anxiety. We had someone come to council last Monday talking about drug addiction in the middle school and kids being exposed to those things. You know, we see an increasity of obesity nationwide. All these things, I really want and hope to be able to work with like more programs for kids to feel that they can do Parks and Rec, right? Oftentimes I feel like the problem with sports is if you're identified of you're not the elite athlete, then why are you going to continue, right? When the reality is you should appreciate the ability just to enjoy the sport. The likelihood of anyone coming out of Moscow being a professional athlete, there's some great athletes. I think it's unlikely. And so I think if the town, if we change our nature and say healthy competition is important, but we have a good rec program from K through like basically like your elementary years, how else in like junior high, summertime things, how can we improve that program? Right? That's one thing that I am really kind of not focused on, but I want to talk about more, right? And like, how can we amplify the Parks and Rec program a little bit more, have it a little bit more organized, and so people feel like they are growing and learning skills, but also they're developing, you know, hopefully a habit of like knowing how to, you know, exercise their body and, you know, all of these other things. And, you know, sports and, you know, recreating come in a variety of ways, right? Why isn't there like a rock climbing club, right? Like, I know there's a mountain biking team, but road cycling and, you know, some of these things have barrier to entries because they're expensive, right? And not everyone can afford that. And that's something we need to be focused on. But like, why can't we why isn't there an intramural volleyball team, right, for kids that aren't on the, you know, the junior high team? Or why aren't we just playing like co-ed dodgeball or something, right? I think there's another way that people can come together and just have fun doing something and not have the goal that I only do this because I'm going to go play college sports or I'm going to try to be a professional athlete. I think that's a lot of parents' goals, but I think the goal should be, I want to teach my kids like how to, you know, exercise. And I think a healthy community where we're teaching kids that, a place where they can get, you know, because I don't know, for me growing up, kids have stresses, they don't know how to talk about them. And for me, an outlet was always being able to play a sport. If you look at my yearbook and if you look at my stats, I wasn't a prodigy for athletics, but I absolutely enjoyed it. I had some lucky catches, I had some, you know, lucky saves, a couple good kicks in my day, but that experience of experiencing that is, I think more kids need to have that. And so maybe it's a chess club organized, you know, through these other ways, but I think the city could extend their services more towards like pre-high school, basically junior high ages.
Just to enable that degree of, it's okay if you're not trying to pursue this professionally, but you should pursue this as just a means of enjoying life. And, you know, both the healthy environment for the sorts of things that you're talking about in terms of getting through stresses and processing like a uniquely stressful time of life for a lot of people, truly. But then also just, you know, you're encouraging maybe a healthier lifestyle, a healthier culture of, you know, participating in community, and hopefully integrating a lot more of those things, because if kids are doing it for life, then hopefully they'll continue those habits as adults, build it into their families if they have families, and see that just self-perpetuate going forward.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think the ability for people just to be able to get out there and do something. And another thing too is you can meet some really good friends, right? It's another way to connect with people. Oftentimes like your schoolmates, you're selected from a very small sampling of the community where you go to school, right? But if you get to interact with kids across, I think friendships are built, and I think that's just really critical and something that's, because people are always on their phones now, right? And we think that you can connect with people through phones, and that is one way of connecting with people. That shouldn't replace in-person conversations, because those skills are still critical. I think I don't see them ever not being critical.
Right.
And so and that's another thing that it can do. And again, it could just be like the walking club. I don't care really what it is. The bird watching club, and those are all great things, that. Maybe the middle school does these things, or other middle schools, but even if you're not the best, if you want to go out and do those things, I think the ability should be there. So the second one that I'll say, because there's two, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is I've ran my campaign on a slogan, and it's not like everything that I'm focused on, but the one thing is Moscow's a diverse town. And diversity is important to Kimi and I to raise our kids here. And so I've, for example, we have my oldest son, he's playing on a soccer team, and he plays with a family, and their son, they're from the Middle East, right? And he's a phenomenal soccer player, and just incredible skill for a young age. And but not only am I impressed with the skill, but just talking to their family, their experiences, that's really valuable for my family. To be able to talk with someone that's from a different culture, different part of literally the world, and being able to talk with that. And so I think if we look around Moscow, there's just differences in how we're raised, the things who we are, religion, political affiliations, lifestyle choices, all those things. And so I've campaigned on the fact that, let's not make differences battle lines, and let's just enjoy it. And we can still retain what's important to us, but we don't have to make someone's difference something that we have to be a point of contention. And so I think that's really what makes a healthy community also.
Yeah, and not to push back on that, but just to delve into it a little bit deeper, because obviously when there are differences and there's the potential for conflict, sometimes the nature of the conflict is unavoidable, or maybe not even conflict, but just controversy, disagreements, that sort of thing. And in your time in council and what you would hope to, as you think about what you would campaign on, what you would hope to do once elected, are there any strategies that you've looked at that you've deemed successful for dealing with conflict resolution of those types?
Yeah, it's probably not the most professional thing to say, but just don't be an a-hole to people. I don't know how else to say it, and I'll say the PG version. I mean, it's not even a PG version, but just being respectful to people, right? I think people and anybody can really get wrapped around the axle of their way of life is the only way of life, right? And so I think if you step back and say, I really feel like if you're confident in your belief system and your way of life, how you're living your life, you necessarily don't have to make others feel bad about how they're living their life, right? And so for me, how I think people, not that I'm going to set policy or anything to do this, but I think if you look at it, is just treat others how you want to be treated. And, Moscow should be a home for everybody. And you might not agree with everybody here, but if you can, I think the best thing you can do is if you have a neighbor, luckily I have all great neighbors, truly I do, but we're also not the same, but if you have someone that you don't understand, I think approach it with civility and just go have a conversation, say, I don't understand how you live, right? I don't understand this, can you explain why you do X, Y, and Z, or why you do this, or it could be anything, right? And I think those conversations are the antidote to help basically infringe this complicated mess of I'm right, you're wrong. If you just try to understand someone's perspective, that doesn't mean you have to accept it, but it does mean that you can just sit there and be like, I didn't know that actually, thank you for explaining that. And sometimes it's just perfectly fine to disagree with somebody. I think people think that if you disagree with someone, that's wrong, and I don't. I think how you handle the disagreement's the problem rather than the actual what you don't agree on. And so I think people need to keep that in mind. It's totally, civil to disagree on something, and it's actually like not rational to say that we're going to believe the same, And so, but what isn't rational is to say, since we don't believe the same, we can't find this common way to live together. And so that's like just my thing, and I think that goes for anyone and everybody in the community. That's not a message to someone or anybody. It's a message for all to say, hey, if I don't understand you, let's have a conversation. And if you're that person who doesn't want to have a conversation, maybe you're the problem.
Yeah. So at one level, if I can summarize what you're talking about here, a lot of the problems with conflict can be readily solved with the right sorts of communication.
For sure.
And, like you said, you might not be able to do anything about that policy-wise, but you can certainly, as an individual, if you get elected or if you're serving in your capacity.
We're going to say I'm going to get elected, but I'm so
okay.
I might regret that after the 7th. But
well, no worries. It's not my problem. But yeah, being able to look at it as a communication problem and working to be the best communicator on that front that you can be when it comes to approaching those subjects. So.
Yeah, no, exactly. And you know what I mean is I think oftentimes people want policy to solve problems, and I think people need to solve problems. And it shouldn't, policy is super important, don't get me wrong. Like we have lots of successful examples and not successful examples of it. But I think if you operate in a world where you can say, I'm going to understand people's differences, that doesn't jeopardize my belief, I think that's a powerful thing and a really important place to pivot from.
And of course, we do live in a nation where people set policies more than policies adjust people, just based on.
Can you say that one more time? That's. I want to make sure I understand that. Sorry.
Yeah. So we live in a nation where people set policies more so than policies set people, if you will. So because of whether you say it's a democratic thing or being in a constitutional republic or whatnot, you end up delivering from what people want, what people say, into policy rather than it being sort of a top-down, like this is what will be, and so everybody's attitude is automatically going to change.
Right, yeah. No, I would agree with that. And so, one thing that I've been knocking doors, talking to people at farmers markets, what have you, after forums, I really feel strongly, there's one thing is, we have the freedom, our founding fathers, we've wrote things, Pilgrims came here to find freedom of religion. And I think that's a very important thing, right? But I also find on the other side of that argument, the freedom not to believe in something is also important. And both need to be respected and be handled with the same amount of care and passion. And so, that's kind of my thoughts on it.
Yeah. Well, I've got one more thing for you.
Okay.
And I just want to give you an opportunity to tell the audience about your campaign and where they can find you.
Okay. Well, Aiden, thanks for having me. Enjoyed the interview. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram. You can also find me on my website. Maybe you could put something in the notes there. But for me, what I want you to know about me, Moscow, is I'm here, and I'm here to talk to people. Listening can resolve a lot of issues, and I might not be able to solve every problem that comes to Moscow, but I can listen to every problem that comes to Moscow, and we can find ways to mitigate things. And if we can't, we can at least understand the why behind that. I'm a family man, and I love Moscow, and I love raising my family here. But I also care about people that don't have families or whoever you may be. As I've said, in other interviews and other forums that I've been really fortunate to be appointed to City Council by Mayor Betke for my professional background, but I also think it has to do with my character. I am someone who listens. I'm someone that can collaborate in councils, and I'm someone that wants to come to decisions that's good for Moscow. I truly believe that societies are most successful when individuals plant trees that they're never going to be able to enjoy the shade of. And so that's my purpose on council. Lots of people in the city have planted trees that my family get to enjoy the shade of. In 30 years, I want to come back or still hopefully be here, but I want to see hopefully things that we've worked on as a community together, and really see how that's taken root and how that's changed Moscow. So thanks for having me, and go vote November 7th. Vote for Davis. Thanks for having me.
And that concludes my conversation with Moscow City Council hopeful Drew Davis. With this video, you'll find a link to his campaign and more for if you want to find out more about his platform, or if you want to get involved in his campaign yourself. As always, if you have any questions, let us know. This is Aiden Anderson with Candidate Candids. See you next time.